Hello and welcome to What Would Jane Do, which is a podcast that takes a light-hearted look at early 19th century perspectives on our modern life through the eyes of what we imagine our favourite author might think. My name is Julia Golding, and I am joined as ever by Katy McFarlane, who is looking resplendent, if you were following this on YouTube, in her bonnet, which more about which anon. Because today's theme, which I have chosen, is you can see it's I've chosen because it plays to my strengths. This one is Jane Austen, the Romantic, or Jane Austen and Romanticism, the movement. Now, Katy, do you want to just explain what you're wearing so those who are listening to the podcast get the
The
conjure
full
up
effect. The
effect?
full
Yeah.
effect. Yes. So, ladies and gentle listeners, I am wearing my full romantic gear, which is a beautiful rose chintz pattern dress, floofy fichu, and my a very romantic shawl with crimson and orange and black, and my piece de resistance, my Marianne hat, made by my favourite hatter, Hats Period, Jane Walton. And it's a bit like a sideways bicorn for those of you who can't see, with beautiful papillinaceous ribbon, silk ribbon, and a massive feather.
Yes, it has quite a sort of military feel, which is
A little bit, yes,
yes,
but needless to say,
with the stripes.
unmilitarized by the colours and the yes, massive feather. And we have a saying in reenactment that the man with the biggest chicken on his hat wins.
You're going in, going in for that competition. Excellent.
Yeah.
But the reference of military is purposeful because a lot of the fashions of the Regency period were influenced by, for women, were influenced by nods to military garb. Anyway, let's go back to Romanticism. What is it? Now, we all know what it means to be romantic, don't we?
I
Do
hope
we?
so.
Yeah. So I looked up, first of all, how Jane Austen used the phrase, and there were two moments, absolutely key moments, that immediately leapt forward. The first one is the Charlotte Lucas phrase. So I'm going to read it out, and then I want you to say, Katy, what you think Charlotte means by this.
Okay, go for
Charlotte
it.
says, I am not romantic, you know. She's talking to Lizzie. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home. So, what is Charlotte saying about the word romantic there?
I think there we can probably put a more modern interpretation onto it in that romance of falling in love with someone, having a grand passion, and then hopefully a happy ending at the end of it. But in Jane Austen's time, as we know, that was more by chance than design, and the chances of you actually meeting someone that you had a lot in common with, because the populace was a lot smaller in those days. I think it said the population of London now is about as how many people were in Great Britain at that time. So the chances of you actually coming into the sphere of someone you were that was the same age as you, same social sphere as you, and same interests as you was a lot smaller than it is now.
Yeah, that's worth pointing out because if you read Regency romance, and why wouldn't you?
Hmm.
It seems to be like a duke and an earl around every corner.
Oh, there's dukes everywhere,
Um,
usually with their shirts off.
hopefully, hopefully. But that is wasn't how it was at all. There's a limited number of titles, and the ton itself was very small. So if you're looking for a well-connected marriage in that sense, your odds are slight. There is a just to sort of gloss what you were saying. I think there is definitely here, and we'll go on and look at this. In that romantic word, there's a sense of taking risks and wild, risky passion.
Yes, because
Is
passion is very risky, as demonstrated in several novels by Jane Austen. And
exactly. So
yes, and another thing that sorry, historically bears mentioning is that you weren't supposed to step out of your social sphere. You were very much frowned upon if you tried to marry up, and even if you managed to marry someone of a higher rank than yourself, you were forever looked down upon for doing that. So that's why Lady Catherine is so against Lizzie Bennet marrying Mr. Darcy, because she's not only taking a good catch off the market, but she's actually raising her expectations, she thinks, from what she should, and is very put down for doing that. Although, as Lizzie Bennet quite rightly mentions, my father is a gentleman, Darcy is a gentleman. So in that sense, they're equal.
Yes, you're a gentleman, I'm a gentleman's daughter. Um,
Yes.
that's right. That all of that is right. But in terms of Charlotte's reference here is not to Lizzie's marriage because it's not yet happened.
No.
This is for explaining to her best friend her decision why she went for a marriage of convenience rather than hold out for something better.
Mm,
Okay, so there's more to unpack there. We'll probably come back to that, circle back. So the other time, which is one where I really cheer every time I read it, comes in Persuasion, where it's said of Anne Elliot, she had been forced into prudence in her youth. She learned romance as she grew older. Now, it's not that term romance there isn't just about love.
mm.
Do you want to sort of, when you read that, what are your thoughts when you read the word romance there?
I think the idea that it's not a grand passion necessarily, but the idea that you can be in sympathy with a partner. Um, you don't necessarily just have to marry for convenience or monetary gain, but the fact that you can actually have someone that you are sympathetic with and can talk with, and I think especially Anne Elliot is very much on her own and lonely, and to have someone who she can talk and laugh with would have been something amazingly romantic in later life. And she's been forced to make a prudent decision earlier on, and now as she grows older, she values friendship and somebody being in sync with her that much more,
It's
maybe.
interesting that Jane opposes the word romance with prudence. So if you think of what prudence means, it means calculating the risks involved and taking
The
safe,
logical choice,
the
yes.
logical, safe, rational. That word is
Hmm.
really important
Very,
here.
yes.
Because we're going to look at the sort of 18th century
Mm,
versus Romanticism. Um, the rational choice. So she
mm.
was persuaded by family and friends that the young officer didn't yet prove himself. It was safer to stay at home, even though she loved him. The romance is that she can take a risk on love, that she learned that the wilder, more risky behavior um, could be actually the better choice.
Yeah. And she discussed that, didn't she, with Wentworth's sister,
Yeah,
and said, "Well, how did it work out for you?" And she said, "Very
yeah,
well." So
exactly.
she had almost the opposite persuasion from what she had in her youth, and older and wiser was maybe better placed to make a balanced judgment about what was worth risking.
So from that, it was a more nuanced word, I think, in
Hmm.
Jane's time than it is now. For us, romantic is like an optimistic view of love, that you have romantic evenings out with people.
Hmm.
It's certainly perhaps a little bit superficial.
Yes, I would say
You could
so.
have a romance,
Hmm.
which feels as though it's like frippery it's not got the underpinning of something long lasting. I think it retains a sort of frivolity about it, maybe. And then it goes into the modern sort of dating programs, which perhaps we'll look at the end as a sort of idea of, who does the bachelor give the rose to and the rest of it. But let's stay in the in Jane's time, where many of us would quite like to live, let's face it, if we were rich and healthy, male, all those things. Anyway, so I want to just throw in here because I've got an academic background, having done my doctorate in this period, so I need to kind of fill in a few bits here as I
Put it
feel
in context.
uncomfortable. That the word romance actually originally attaches itself to a kind of story, an early form of novel, where it would be sort of fanciful. We might call them fantasy novels now, in a way.
Hmm.
Um,
And I think wasn't Horace Walpole the first obvious, well, first named romantic with the Castle of Otranto. I think
He
that
was,
was
yeah, he was the first of,
1764, I think I've got.
yeah. So that novel begins the Gothic.
Hmm.
But yes, but it actually romances themselves come out of medieval literature.
Hmm.
It's
Yes.
kind of knights in armor, quests, and all that kind of thing. And if you're thinking, well, where does it stop being a romance, become a novel? I will point you to the evidence of Don Quixote, which walks this line between having the trappings of a romance. He feels he's tilting at giants when they're windmills but it's also a novel because you're aware of the real world around him, but yet he's a fanciful character. So there's a whole fascinating, much ink has been spilled on this subject. So that's where the word romance comes from. And it's from Roman. It's from a sort of southern, comes out of the literature of the sort of European literature. That's what the word is about, rather than love.
Hmm.
However, in Jane's era, we've reached the time of Romanticism, and that was the name of when I did my first part of my doctoral course. It was called Romanticism, and
Hmm.
I had to always be very careful when I went up to people. And I'm studying Romantic literature, and they think, what, Mills and Boone, here we come. So no, we're talking about literature, which was roughly, depending where you are in Europe, it's roughly about 1790 to about 1850, with
Hmm.
people dropping in and out. Anyway, it puzzled me, Katie, it puzzled me that Jane wasn't really part of that movement.
Hmm.
And so that when I went to the lectures, the Jane Austen lectures, run by the great Fiona Stafford, were kind of separate because she doesn't fit. And what did fit were the poets Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, Byron,
Keats.
Keats, Shelley, Lee Hunt, if you want to go a bit more obscure. Blake is sort of slightly, he's a bit like Jane Austen, but he's
Hmm.
more attached to
Hmm.
romanticism because he's so wild and wacky. Over, it sort of starts in Germany, so there are a lot of German playwrights. You've got to remember that Jane loves plays and playwrights, so she would have certainly known about that. Um, and through my sort of checking back in my notes, I think the first person, known person, to talk about romanticism is Friedrich Schlegel, the German poet, who calls it literature depicting emotional matter in imaginative form, which is kind
Hmm.
of all literature. But let's say what he really means by that, Friedrich, is it's a kind of heightened emotion with a strong emphasis on exposure to nature and a strong emphasis on rediscovering your local roots as opposed to Greek and Roman roots. Why? Because, and I'm going to stop my little diatribe. Um, why? It's because it's setting itself up in opposition to the people who came before. Nobody likes to copy their parents' generation. So the classicism, the neoclassical era of the Enlightenment with the rational sort of Pope,
Hmm.
Alexander Pope and Dr. Johnson, all those people who sort of talked about reason and um, philosophy based on rational, sort of logical step by step.
Hmm. Hmm.
Architecture drawn from Greek and Rome with the sort of even pillars, all that
A
stuff.
balanced view. Yeah.
Well, yeah, which is all about moderation, prudence, and sort of combating the animal passions and being a man of reason.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, I mean, you can see again, if you put it in the context of what was going on in Europe, at least,
mm,
when you have the French Revolution, the overturning of the monarchy, a lot of people would have seen turning the world on its head, and a lot of animal passions let loose in the streets of Paris, um, beheading people as an extreme version of that. It must have seemed very comforting to have people talking about logic and reason and um,
yeah,
governing oneself.
the Enlightenment begins earlier, and I think
Mm,
it might have been almost they would have turned because they were long because Romanticism coincides with the French Revolution,
yes,
and
yes.
that's on purpose. The
Hmm.
two go together. A lot of the Enlightenment people would have turned around and said, "We told you so."
Hmm.
So that's partly what you get in Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Anyway, I'm going slightly into the weeds here,
Yes.
or perhaps a bit deeper than people want. Um, but it is a fascinating, doesn't mean that Enlightenment stops.
No.
Romanticism starts as though there's like one tap switched off. It's a
Hmm.
mixer tap where perhaps one gets less and the other gets stronger. And Jane Austen, the reason she doesn't fit in my Romanticism course is that she is her father's daughter and she has inherited a lot of the, well, she's read the people who are writing at that time. That's what she grew up on. And she has like this kind of plain common sense, which a lot of us detect in her, that keeps her on the, she rational side of it quite often. Anyway, so when Jane is using the term romantic, she's she's not able to use the whole romanticism big label, which is more of a hindsight thing that we talk about
Hmm.
now. But she would be aware that some of the writers that she's writing alongside are regarded as being more romantic. So what do you know about the lake poets and Byron and Shelley and all that in terms of romanticism? Because they are mentioned, of course, or at least
Yes, they are. Yes. Uh, basically, well, I visited Wordsworth House, which is a nice little house in the Lake District and beautiful surroundings. And I've been to the Coleridge Museum, which again was very interesting. So I probably know as much as the average person. Seen the Byron photo of him, a picture of portrait of him dressed in Turkish uh, uh, romantic uniform. I've actually seen the real thing as well in a stately home. So I'm aware of these people as famous in their time and obviously still famous now, and people swooning over the poets. And I think there's a lovely bit in Blackadder when Dr. Johnson's dictionary is supposedly burnt, and the poets come to his defense and start challenging Blackadder to a duel.
right.
So
So
yes, they're very romantic figures, and I think I'm aware of them as uh, wanting to be close to nature
yeah,
and promote passions inspired by nature.
yeah. So in a way, Lizzie Bennet would be um, on their side because she likes her
Hmm.
walks in nature. So if you, this is why I'm saying Jane doesn't completely buy into one side of this. Her heroines tend to be country bred,
Hmm.
which is the location of most romantic poetry. Just checking that. A lot of it, anyway. Um, so, but actually, we need to do some readjustment. When Jane is alive, because she dies relatively early on in the period
Yeah, she
of
does.
Romanticism,
Hmm.
the people who were known as famous poets at that time were not Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth's fame comes much later. He is discovered really by the Victorians.
Hmm.
He and Coleridge were like radical poets in the 1790s who had a manifesto set of poems called the Lyrical Ballads, which were trying to say in that collection is the Ancient Mariner, for example. So you
Hmm.
know that poem, you know it's got a fantastical, magical feel. That's a romance.
Yeah.
But also they were trying to challenge the expectation that everybody in poetry sort of spoke like idealized, like pastoral shepherds and shepherdesses and that kind of thing, by recording the voices of the poor and the outcasts. But they
Hmm.
were trying to bring more of a common, everyday working person's language into poetry. And this goes alongside people like Robert Burns and uh, John Clare and other poets like that. But they were mocked at the
Hmm.
time. So it's not likely that Jane Austen would have known an awful lot about them, though she probably was aware of Coleridge as a lecturer in London, because he was a brilliant, erratic but brilliant mind.
I think she was aware of Walter Scott.
Yeah, let me say so. I'm now going to
Okay.
who she does know.
Okay.
Yes,
I,
thank you. She is where there's a discussion in Persuasion with who's the lovelorn love,
uh, Captain Benwick.
yeah, that chap, about the poetry of Byron and Walter Scott. So Walter
Mhm.
Scott was primarily known, started off as known as a poet for things like Lady of the Lake, and Marmion. Marmion, by the way, is the origin of uh, sorry, I've forgotten what it is now. Um, Never mind, I'll cut that bit out because I
This will come
forgot.
back to,
Anyway,
yeah.
so Walter Scott is the poet primarily known for things at this stage as Lady of the Lake and Marmion.
Hmm.
Um, and Byron was the wunderkind, he was the flashy, guy everybody wanted to go to bed with, or, you know, he's that sex symbol of his era.
Hmm.
Hard to tell from from the pictures, but that was what worked at the time. Apparently his eyes were mesmerizing. Good, excellent. So that discussion between Anne and Captain Benwick, do you remember what Anne's advice is?
To leaven his poetry reading with a bit of prose so it didn't overpower him, something like that.
Yes, that's right. So she sees the danger of indulging in
Too
too
much.
much. Yeah,
And she shows that, I think, in Marianne later on,
yeah.
of who will want nothing but poetry and is overcome with a storm of emotions at the drop of a hat. I've got a
So,
lovely quote here from Jane Austen when Walter Scott produced the novel Waverley,
hmm,
sort of celebrating Scottish history, dealing with the Jacobite uprising. And as it said, an event that was still remembered by many when Jane Austen was born. As she remarked to her niece Anna a few weeks after its publication in 1814, so not long before she died, Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones. It is not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet and should not be taking the bread out of other people's mouths. I do not like him and do not mean to like him, do not mean to like Waverley if I can help it, but I fear I must. I have made up my mind to like no novels really, but Miss Edgeworth's, yours and my own. So Anna was currently immersed in writing a novel, some of which Jane was critiquing for her, which is quite nice. But I
so
think
that,
that's a lovely comment on, obviously joking,
yeah,
saying about Waverley's fame and possibly about her relative obscurity as a result. But it's a nice sort of comment on her contemporaries, isn't
yeah. I mean, Walter Scott was the big thing
it? Mm,
as a novelist till certainly during the 19th century and into the 20th century,
mm,
in a way that perhaps we don't understand now. And Waverley is the first of many novels which talks of a young man sort of adrift in the Jacobite uprising, but he also went on to write other famous novels like Ivanhoe, which is
mm.
a medieval one. And
Yes.
his version of Romanticism is that idea of going back to roots and the idea of nationalism, but also a sort of nostalgia about the past that
Mm.
probably didn't really exist.
As we have nostalgia about Jane Austen today,
Yeah,
or the Regency period, certainly.
well, Bridgerton.
Fueled by a lot of romances.
In a way, Walter Scott is kind of like Bridgerton. With
Yes, I
less
suppose
sex.
he is.
With less sex. Anyway, so if you want to sort of find out a bit more about what Romanticism is about, if I do a plug for my next book, which is called The Wordsworth Key, which is my Regency puzzle mystery, I've purposely
Third
code.
book.
Thank you. I've purposely coded into that gently, so you don't feel like you're being lectured. A sort of exploration of all this area of what Romanticism was, what did it lack? Not many women in it, notice, and so on. The women were in it in another way, which is how we're going to turn solidly to Jane, because Gothic novelists, a genre dominated by women, really, even though we've mentioned the Castle of Otranto, but
Mm,
let's do a shout out for the Gothic novelists of the time. Um, that's one area where Jane is connected to what would be regarded as an expression of Romanticism as a critic. So, Katy, have a go at Northanger Abbey and Marianne and all those sort of ways
yeah,
in which Jane is
I
undercutting
was trying
Romanticism.
to, yeah, I was trying to think. Well, it always annoys me, and I'm sure it annoys you, if anyone describes Jane Austen's novels as romances, because yes, there is a romantic element in there, undoubtedly, but it's not what I would call romances per se. There is a romantic element, but it's more of a social study, really. But I was thinking, okay, who are the most obvious romantic characters that spring to mind in Jane Austen's novels? And the obvious one, of course, is Marianne Dashwood from Sense and Sensibility. She's all sensibility, and her sister Eleanor is all sense. And almost dies because of her infatuation or love for her rather unsuitable beau. Lydia could be called very romantic for eloping and thinking it, wildly romantic and passionate to elope with Wickham. Maria Bertram has a disastrous romance with Henry Crawford after she's married, so it puts her quite beyond the pale. And of course, Louisa Musgrove having a passionate initial reaction to Captain Wentworth and then transferring affections to another passionate captain, Captain Benwick, in Persuasion. Harriet Smith is willing to fall in love at the drop of a hat and is very changeable in her loves, but eventually settles for her first love, which I think is lovely. And finally, of course, my favourite, Catherine Morland, devourer of Gothic romances, and again, willing to throw herself or imagine herself in a romance, and then obviously being brought up short by the reality of the situation. And that for me is the ultimate critique, if you like, of the idea of romance versus practicality and reality.
Yeah, and it's an interesting critique of the Gothic novel because Northanger Abbey is all about the dangers that you think you're facing um, aren't the ones that exist, it's something else. So I mean, the ending of it, she's sent home on her own in a carriage,
Disgrace,
which
yes.
is very dangerous.
It's incredibly
So
dangerous. Yeah.
Jane Austen isn't saying that the really rational sort of spoof of it would
Mm.
be that he turns out to be a charming man and there's no opposition and they all it's not that it's saying look, the Gothic danger, the risk in society isn't in a an old abbey building and,
Yes.
and chests and
Villainous monks and
yeah,
skulls and
it's none
things.
of that. It
Mm.
is in the passions and the prejudices of people who are dressed up as civil
Yes, yes.
beings, and that thread then connects because obviously Northanger Abbey is an early work. It then connects to Willoughby,
Hmm.
who is he could be Byron,
Yes, he could be. Yes, and
uh,
again,
predates Byron,
wildly
anticipates him.
romantic from the very first. It's a romantic trope for a reason. Picking up Marianne into his arms and carrying her off. If that isn't romantic, I don't know what is. And then in perfect contrast, Colonel Brandon later on rescuing her, but in a far more practical way,
Mm.
and bringing her mother to her, which isn't so romantic, but is obviously much
Useful.
appreciated by both systems. Useful, exactly. So yes, in Georgette Heyer, there's a wonderful romantic hero. Well, no, he's a side character, but he's the ideal romantic hero is constantly, with dishevelled clothing and challenging people to duels. And eventually, by the end of the book, the heroine is actually fed up with him because he's just not practical and just gets in the way all the time.
But there is also a quiet. I think that the odd thing about Colonel Brandon is that he is actually a romantic character
He is, and
in
he has a
that
spirit
old
of
sense
romance.
of the word.
Yes,
He's
yes.
traveled, he's
Hmm.
military, he's capable, he fights a duel.
And he loves poetry and can quote poetry with great feeling.
So it's almost as though Jane Austen is cleverly setting up the idea of here's this flashy romantic figure,
Hmm.
but actually
Yes,
Marianne is a better fit with this one who isn't going to
let
ruin
her
her.
down.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So, indeed, Jane is definitely sort of examining the damage that romantic in the big R romantic
Yes, yes.
heroes and heroines do. It doesn't come out of nowhere. There's a whole series of books at the time which look at sort of the man of feeling and self-control, all these kind of titles,
Mm.
looking at what is the healthiest, we might these days call it, what is the healthiest mental state to be in to have a successful relationship. That is what those books are about.
Mm.
So, yes, she is critical of um, those who,
Heedless romance.
yeah,
Romance governed by nothing but passion and presumption, really, without really knowing somebody. Whereas I
yeah.
think all her most successful and ultimately, for me, most romantic relationships are the ones where they are a good match, as you say, for each other and balance each other out and support each other
So,
rather
talk,
than wreck each other.
yeah, so let's talk about Lizzie Bennet to start with.
Hmm.
All the Bennet sisters, actually,
Mm.
it's different people on this, different places on the scale. So, you've
Mm.
got, I think Jane is also a romantic.
Yes.
She's she wants love and she's heartbroken and she gets herself a little bit ill. Like,
And she has a romantic notion in terms of thinking the best of everyone she meets and trying to find the good in everyone she meets. So not necessarily uh, well, not very cynical. But the one thing Jane is good in terms of being a very dutiful daughter. So she's willing to forego her romantic hopes for the good of her family, and that's practical, isn't it? I suppose.
yeah, well, because Bingley is definitely like the male version of her.
Yes, and that's why they're such a good match because, as Mr.
So
Bennett says, they will be impoverished by
cheated by their servants,
servants. Yes.
which you can totally see. You have
Oh
to hope
yes.
that Darcy comes round to sort of say, "Excuse me, Bingley,
Yes.
you're going to lose your
Yes.
fortune." One suspects he will. No, she's definitely a romantic, but unlike, so let's skip over Lizzie for the moment.
Yes.
Um, we've got Mary, who I think represents Enlightenment rationalism,
Hmm.
particularly quoting things like Fordyce's sermons and all that sort of, a woman's reputation is,
Fragile and once lost is
lost
lost
forever. Yeah.
forever. Yeah.
That's the kind of stuff you find in those sort of Enlightenment. Let's be rational about this.
Hmm.
She's that kind of figure. Kitty, I think, is it doesn't really emerge with her own character particularly because she's a
She's
scholar.
very young and she's obviously very swayed by the naughty Lydia, who's
Mm.
obviously a more definitely full of romantic ideals. Like any young girl before she's really experienced the world, it's all about her putting her romantic ideals onto anyone she meets, really, whether they actually are like that or not.
And then we get, you've already mentioned Lydia. I'd forgotten her, but of course she is the dangerous romantic
Mm.
figure in that she, unlike Jane, who is romantic but has a rational sort of understanding of or cares that it will hurt
Mm.
others,
Yes.
Lydia doesn't. And in that way, she is her mother. Her mother was only saved for respectability by marrying her very Enlightenment father. So you've got in that marriage, you've got the passionate, out of control mother with the father who retreats to the library and to read Pope and Essay on Man and stuff.
Yes, they
So,
don't balance
yeah,
each other so much as sort of move around each other like two planets in orbit, really,
yeah,
without colliding. But
it
I
kind
think
of.
Mrs. Bennet has an underlying desperation to get her daughters married, and so I think she's very aware of the real things about that. But she is prone to being very selfish as well, making it all about her. And Lydia, in that respect, is definitely like her mother in terms of not having much empathy for the trials of anyone else, and it's all about her and what she wants first and foremost.
So circling back, I think what we get in Lizzie and the reason why she's such a successful heroine is that she is a balance.
Mm.
So she does want love and she's looking for love and she wants to marry for love rather than for sort of convenience like Charlotte.
Mm.
But she is also aware of the consequences. So, for example, one of the mistakes she makes is she doesn't um, tell everybody what Wickham was really like, but she does that because she doesn't want to create damage for other
No, and she
people.
wants to be fair as
Mm,
well, and obviously has hopes that he might reform himself. And also, she wants, yes, as you say, she doesn't want to damage Georgiana's reputation, and
yeah.
and probably by extension Mr. Darcy's reputation.
And
And
she's keeping her confidence as well.
yes, absolutely. No, and even the slightest, as she says, the slightest hint of scandal, and why Lydia's running away in such a public arena is so damaging. It affects the entire family. It doesn't just affect the woman who would get cast out with the very slightest smear on her reputation, which is very unfair because Wickham doesn't suffer like that. But she's, as soon as Lydia does run off, um, she's aware that that's damaged the chances of her family and her sisters herself.
Yes. And so if you think about, if you run it as if she had been the full-on romantic without regard, she would have rushed back to Meryton if she believed Darcy's version of events,
Hmm.
said that bound her. And she would have made a great song and dance about it. She'd have made um
Well, she would have been like Mrs. Bennet and basically told, 6 dozen of her closest friends
yeah,
about it, and then gone on about it forevermore. I never liked him. His eyes were too close together.
yeah. Until he marries the daughter and then
Until he marries the yes, and then makes it
best
all right
thing. Yeah.
again. No, it is. You're right. It's very interesting that even in one family, Jane Austen manages to have such a contrast of characters that make absolute sense in how they behave. It's not like extremes, but they are very individual characters, aren't they?
Mm. And I think it's helpful to understand them through how the contemporary world would have understood how the
Mm,
contemporary world would have understood them, with this debate going on between the Enlightenment and Romanticism. So let's rest the Jane's novel part by looking at Anne Elliot. There are other places we could go, like the Juvenilia of Jane Austen is all a spoof of sort of
yes, yes,
romanticism.
that's right. It is
Anyway,
very funny.
we'll leave that to one side for the moment.
Mm,
Um, but with Anne Elliot, it has the wonderful melancholia the of wisdom. It's like romanticism is a kind of adolescence in a way, callow youth, a coming of age thing, but it's also necessary not to reject that part of yourself, but carry it on in the right way. So in a way, Anne got her life the wrong way round. She
mm.
started off by being too wise and too prudent and too risk adverse. And that comment about her learning romance is to say, well, actually, this freedom to love is is also necessary. Um,
And I
but
think
she,
it's interesting that Persuasion is her last book, last full book. So she's coming at it, and why a lot of women say they love Pride and Prejudice first, but as they get older, they appreciate Persuasion more.
mm,
Um, and a lot of people make the mistake, I think, of seeing Anne Elliot as a very passive person and easily guided, but in fact, she's the one that holds the family together against against all the odds, and is very strong, I think, in doing so with a family that is utterly selfish, and she's the one that perseveres really against all odds.
she picks her battles. I think that's what's
Yes, she
interesting.
does.
So with her friend Miss Smith,
Mm.
she goes even though it would have been easier to fall in with her father's path.
Rather. Mm.
But she goes anyway and is rewarded by hearing the truth about the other Mr. Elliot.
Mm.
So, but she didn't go because she knew she was going to get the information.
No, no, she did it to stand up for her friend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think when we talk about Jane Austen and romanticism, I think it's fun to see Jane Austen not separate from the romantic movement, but as a commentator upon weaving in and out of it, taking elements for approval and disapproval to fuel her novels.
Mm.
Um, And I find her actually a very good lens through which to regard romanticism, because I do find a lot of the poets, and most of them are men, they all are they do see the world through a masculine lens, whereas Jane Austen is saying, hang on, it's a bit more complicated if you're a woman in this world.
Mm.
The penalties are higher, the consequences, family consequences are greater, because Byron can sort of have a family and then leave and go
Hmm.
have affairs around Europe and die in the
Yeah.
cause of Greek independence. that's a romantic life, but it's also a hugely damaging life.
Mm.
Um, so I'm on Jane's
Yes.
side when it comes to
Yes, absolutely. No, he was a man who was wealthy, titled, society loved him. He had the freedom to be romantic. And as Charlotte Lucas reminds us, a lot of women don't have that freedom, don't have that ability to throw caution to the winds, because if they do that, the consequences are absolutely serious.
yeah.
And as Jane Austen interestingly shows, Charlotte has made the right choice for Charlotte in that she has a house of her own, not independence as such, but she has her own little fiefdom within that house, and she manages Mr. Collins very well for her own benefit.
Yeah, in a way, it's a kind of reverse of the Bennett marriage.
Mm,
You know, she's this one, the rational, calm one, and Mr. Collins is the one sort of always, rough.
flying off the handle and being
Yeah.
very passionate about Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
And she's just sort of saying, like, hopefully she'll have a lovely little family who loves her.
Yes,
This is
yeah,
our hope.
you can see her being a very good mother.
Yeah. So when it comes to romantic love, going back to where we started, away from romanticism, I think that Jane Austen is still leading the way for us because the reason I like her book so much is, well, there's myriads of reasons, but one of them is they're so wise.
Mm,
And if you're going to marry somebody, it should be a mixture of attraction and friendship. It can't be one or the other, really, or
mm,
convenience.
yeah.
You should aim for something deeper. And you do feel that her couples go through this process to have both those elements in
Yes.
the marriage.
No, it is very interesting, isn't it? Um, how, well, Lizzie Bennet, for example, it's first impressions that are then tempered with experience and time and circumstance. So her heroine's first impression of the person they will end up with is usually a good one, or apart from Lizzie Bennet's possibly, but their instincts are good. But sometimes they have to go through uh, the whole book before they realize that or get what they should. And as you say, Jane Austen drops little hints in people's actions as to who will actually be suitable for her heroines, and that
Yeah.
you hopefully pick up.
So, sort of picking up on that, I think it's clear that she's not in favor of the reformed rake idea, which is
No,
another standard
she's got
trope of
two not
Regency.
reformed rakes, hasn't she? She's got Willoughby and Wickham, who are utterly unreformed,
Well,
which
Willoughby
is quite
sort
interesting.
of,
Sort of reforms, but not to the extent of
he's not
actually.
he's not, he says he's all about heart, but he's heartless in
Yeah,
the end.
yeah.
And Wickham, I think we can all agree, is a bounder and a cad.
Oh, yeah, and utterly selfish. But
Yeah.
it's interesting that Willoughby apparently, or is shown to be in some dramas, regretful, but not so regretful that he utterly changes his character or anything. It's just like, oh, I'm sorry, I got found out, or
Yeah.
we wanted to have my cake and eat it. So it is very interesting that she doesn't do some sort of syrupy sermonizing. Oh well, if you repent, if you ask forgiveness, then it's all fine.
Mm.
She shows people with selfish characters as not really changing those selfish characters.
Yeah, so that's the steely glint in the eye of Jane Austen, which stops her
Mm,
being a sort of soppy romance
yes,
writer.
yes, no, it's not. And that's why I suppose modern view of romance is possibly that everything is rosy, everything's lovely, people are always madly in love with each other, and nothing nasty ever happens to them, and they have no faults. Whereas Jane Austen's view of romance is it can be very dangerous. It can have consequences if you don't keep your head. Um, but in an ideal relationship, as you say, it's a mixture of the romantic love, but also friendship. love and friendship.
Yeah, to coin the
Rising up.
title, yes. So just we were talking about sort of our modern predilection for dating shows and all that kind of thing. We have talked about this in the early days of this podcast. I looked at this, but coming back to this from the idea of romanticism, what's interesting here, I think, is that Jane Austen would still be saying the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like Shakespeare. People love her books because they recognize
Yeah.
characters that are still prevalent today. Shakespeare has many profound things to say about all sorts of subjects, and you can recognize those traits today. So she's a classic for that reason. Is basic human nature has not changed. It may have had different technology applied to it, but it's still at base level the same.
Yeah, and I think, the Ton Ballroom was the equivalent of a sort of reality TV dating show, if you think about it. And I don't think she feels that you'll find your partner there necessarily.
No,
Um,
well, if you're not very careful, you'll end up with John Thorpe.
yeah. So it's the look at people off the stage of public life and look to see what their true characters are, how they show themselves in a crisis, which in
Mm,
those frothy Love Island type things you're not ever going to see because
no.
the nature of it is not encouraging the right sort of love. It's encouraging the froth without the substance.
Well, I don't watch dating shows because they drive me insane in terms of I find them totally fake, totally contrived, with people I have absolutely nothing in common with or want to have anything in common with. They're all very superficial and selfish. It seems to me. I mean, Jane Austen would have an absolute field day with some of the
Oh,
characters
I'd
on
love her to write. I mean, come
Love
back to me
Island or
today
something.
and take it on. That'd be just hilarious.
They're
I
all
mean,
prancing around in bikinis or the shortest of shorts and showing off their bodies. I
Miss
mean,
Bingley,
Walter Elliot would be an absolute prime
Walter
candidate.
Elliot, Miss Bingley, put them in Love Island. That's the film concept.
Oh my goodness. There you
We've
go.
patented it here.
Sell it here.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you. That was an interesting chat about romanticism. And as I said, if you want to find out more, I've put details of the Wordsworth key coming up at the end of this, and in the show notes. So, do we have any Jane Austen news, or
Yes,
should
do we?
we broaden
Boy,
it
do
out
we?
to Regency news?
Regency
Because,
news.
yeah.
Yes. Well, basically, there are balls everywhere, as I keep saying. Jane Austen 2050 is just a chance for people to get dressed up all over the shop. As America seems to be having more Jane Austen events than England does. But the ones I have selected for you, gentle viewer and listener, Sudbury Hall National Trust property in Derbyshire. Where else? Saturday, 7th of June to Sunday, 6th of July. It's got a Pemberley fashion show with original 1995 Pride and Prejudice costumes on display, but only for a very short while, only for about a month. Chatsworth Ball, they're having they're having two grand balls. 12th of December is already sold out. There's another one on 19th of December at Chatsworth. And viewers, I am going to the Pride and Prejudice weekend, which is actually a long weekend, 13th to the 15th of June. Chatsworth is going all out for the 2050 celebrations. It's having theatre, live talks, workshops, bonnet making, dance. The Jane Austen dancers from Bath are going to be there, and costume performers. I'm going to be there with my caro sposo, Richard McFarlane, promenading up and down everywhere I can get to in Chatsworth. So it's going to be a weekend to end all weekends for Pride and Prejudice. And of course, Lime Park, if you fancy getting dressed up yourself and don't happen to have the gear on hand, they will costume you out. There's a little costume room at Lime Park. So if you fancied strolling around the lake with a parasol, and that is your chance. And of course, my shameless plug for my dear husband at Bankfield Museum still has a costume drama exhibition running until December. It's free. Go and see my favourite costume for Lizzie Bennet of the sort of curry-coloured Spencer and lovely bronze little woven bonnet, and obviously Mr. Darcy's wet shirt. and the entirety of his outfit, not just the shirt, and Emma's lovely yellow pelisse are all on show for you to look close up at and have a gander at. So do go and see that while it's on, because it's a really lovely exhibition, if I say so.
Yes, can you say the address of that again?
Bankfield Museum in Halifax, West Yorkshire.
Okay. And in other Jane Austen news, of course, there's you can't move without Jane Austen stuff coming out this year. I've got a novel involving her as well coming out.
Do
Not
you,
quite
Julian?
yet.
Do you
Yeah,
really?
but I'm just want you to think about Wordsworth at the moment.
Yeah.
But obviously they are making the other Bennett sister at the moment.
Yes, and they're making a new version of Pride and Prejudice, Netflix.
Yes.
Get it right, Netflix.
One, I'm not entirely sure about some of the casting choices. I think Olivia Colman and Mrs. Bennett.
Yeah, she's that's a good one.
Great.
That's a good one. I'm going to reserve judgment about Emma Corrin and the Ginger Darcy. So we will see if
what's his name again?
I've forgotten his name. Poor
guy
chap.
from Slow Horses.
He looks interesting. I think interesting.
I quite like him in Slow Horses. So and he's Scottish as well. So he's
give him a chance.
There is a reason for the gingerness. Not that you need an excuse.
I think it could be interesting. Yeah.
I wonder if he's going to keep his beard because he's only ever
I hope
seen
not,
him.
because you didn't have beards in the Regency. If you had a beard in the Regency period, you were either mad or old and infirm and couldn't shave. That's the only possible excuse.
Anyway, he's excellent in Slow Horses. So
yes, well, that's a good start, isn't it?
I'm not sure about Emma Corrin at all. At all.
The jury is out.
And maybe it's because I've not seen her in enough things.
No.
But I don't know that she strikes me as having the zest. But we'll see. That's the challenge, is to have that ineffable sparkle, which of course
charisma.
Yeah. Others have done very well. So she's got a stiff.
Yeah, it is. I always feel very sorry for any new productions of Jane Austen.
That is very true.
They have got a very high. They've got a high benchmark, and they've got a rabid fan base who are going to always decide that it's not what they envisaged in their head, which is no TV program can possibly live up to.
So let's not
compare and contrast. I generally think the more the merrier. Each brings its own version of events.
The one thing I've remembered the guy's name. Sorry about my brain.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Slow on the uptake, but it's Jack Lowden, isn't it?
That's it. Yes.
Yeah, well, and what I do like about him is he definitely has a sense of humor and a twinkle.
Yes, Darcy should have a twinkle.
He is the one who said about him being the Ginger Darcy.
Yes, no, he laughs at himself, so that's a good start, isn't it?
So.
Yeah,
I'm actually looking forward to what he does.
Yeah,
I saw him more I saw him more of as a Bingley, I think.
Yeah, I did as well. But I'm willing to be converted.
Yeah, we will stand ready. Okay, thank you very much, Katy, for joining me today. That's great.
My pleasure as always.
And just as a little teaser trailer, we've just agreed that Katy is off to Waterloo.
I am.
To support the troops there for the 210th anniversary gathering there. And so we will take a report from the front line later in the summer when she gets back.
If I survive, the odds are not looking good. But the 33rd we're on the ridge, so
yeah, you're not channeling your push. You're channeling.
No, I'm definitely a woman of the camp. I'm not a camp follower. I'm a legally married woman of the camp, and I'm supporting my regiment.
Okay.
A subtle distinction, but necessary.
Yes, quite a big distinction.
Quite a big distinction.
Okay, thanks very much, Katy.
Can't manage without you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Goodbye.